Why do you sing about love all the time?
Because love concerns people. Love is something everybody is trying to get right.
He was the velvet voice behind the greatest love songs of a generation, yet so few truly knew the man behind the microphone. Fame embraced him, but true recognition always seemed to keep its distance. His songs filled wedding halls, quiet bedrooms, and late-night car rides, but behind every note was a story rarely told. Why did the world celebrate his music, but overlook his struggles? Why did we dance to his ballads, while missing the pain that fueled them? This is the story of Luther Vandross, beloved, brilliant, and still somehow underrated. Before the headlines, before the Grammys, before the world called him the soundtrack of love, there was simply a quiet boy from New York who was deeply in love with music. A boy who sat for hours studying every record, hearing not just melodies but the breaths, the tears, the whispers hidden inside them. That obsession would shape one of the purest voices in modern history. Luther didn't crave scandal or spectacle. He wasn't the life of the party or the face of tabloids. He was something rarer, the soul in the song. On stage, he needed no fireworks, just a microphone, a spotlight, and the truth in his voice. That truth captivated millions. And yet, even at the height of his success, he remained an enigma, guarded, private, and searching for something more than applause. The world knew the records, but not the man. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a legend whose voice still echoes through time, a genius of phrasing, of feeling, of love. This is the untold story of Luther Vandross. Long before Luther Vandross became the soundtrack of romance, he was simply a boy from Manhattan carrying a gift he barely understood. Born on the 20th of April, 1951, in the Kips Bay neighborhood, Luther Vandross Jr. was the youngest of 4 children. His mother, Mary Ida, worked long shifts as a nurse, steady and practical, while his father, Luther Sr., earned a living as an upholsterer. But the elder Vandross was far more than a craftsman of fabric and wood. He carried a baritone voice that filled their small apartment with unexpected depth. Those tones lingered in the walls, shaping the boy who shared his name. That household comfort, however, did not last. When Luther was just 8 years old, tragedy struck. His father died from complications related to diabetes, leaving Mary to raise 4 children alone. The loss was devastating, not only because it fractured the family's daily rhythm, but because it silenced the first voice Luther had ever admired. In the quiet that followed, grief weighed heavy, and a young boy began to look for solace elsewhere. He found it in music. For Luther, music was not background noise, it was a lifeline. Hours were spent alone in his bedroom, a stack of vinyl records spinning endlessly. He immersed himself in the voices of Aretha Franklin, Patti LaBelle, Dionne Warwick, and Diana Ross. Where other children might have danced or hummed along, Luther dissected. He studied every nuance, the rise and fall of a phrase, the subtle tremor of a held note, the way a singer could reveal heartbreak in a single breath. It wasn't play, it was apprenticeship. He was training his ear in ways that would set him apart for the rest of his life. At William Howard Taft High School in the Bronx, Luther was known as the quiet student. He wasn't loud or flamboyant, but when he opened his mouth to sing, silence fell. Classmates and teachers alike recognized the immensity of his gift. He joined a collective called Listen My Brother, a group that combined young talent with professional polish. It was with this ensemble that Luther caught his first glimpse of national attention, performing on Sesame Street in the early 1970 seconds. For a teenager, it was a small miracle to see his voice broadcast beyond the neighborhood into living rooms across the country. Yet even then, his ambitions weren't about fame. He wasn't chasing cameras or applause. His goal was excellence. By 1969, Luther graduated from high school and took a tentative step toward the conventional path, enrolling at Western Michigan University. For a year, he tried classrooms and routines, but the spark wasn't there. While his peers filled notebooks with lecture notes, Luther's imagination remained fixed on melodies. The studio, not the lecture hall, was where his heart beat fastest. After 1 year, he made the kind of decision most would call reckless. He dropped out. He traded security for uncertainty, a safe degree for the dangerous dream of becoming a full-time songwriter and singer in an industry famous for devouring talent. The early years of that decision were brutal. Nights were long, paychecks non-existent. He sang on demos without credit, arranged harmonies that no one outside the studio would ever know he crafted. Yet in those hidden hours, He refined skills that would make him indispensable. He learned how to blend voices until they shimmered, how to create the illusion of a choir with just a few singers, how to add silk without smothering soul. Slowly, quietly, his reputation began to spread. Word reached respected names: Roberta Flack, Chaka Khan, and then, in one of those improbable intersections history loves, David Bowie. In 1975, Bowie was recording Young Americans and wanted a fresh texture for his title track. Luther was hired to arrange and provide background vocals. It seemed an odd pairing: British glam rock icon meets Bronx-bred R&B student, but the result was electric. Luther's soulful touch is woven deep into the song's DNA. For Bowie, it was a collaboration that expanded his sound. For Luther, it was a revelation. Someone saw in him more than just a background voice. Bowie recognized a visionary. That recognition mattered. It meant his talent wasn't invisible anymore. But Luther was still, at this stage, waiting in the wings. The world hadn't yet put his name on the marquee. He was earning a reputation inside the industry, even as ordinary listeners had no idea that the lush harmonies they loved bore his fingerprints. For Luther, this period was both humbling and galvanizing. He knew he had something rare. He knew, too, that it wasn't enough to be good behind the scenes. If he wanted the world to understand what he carried, he would eventually have to step forward. The seeds of that future were planted here, in the crucible of loss, solitude, and relentless study. From the apartment in Kips Bay to the stages of Sesame Street, from the grief of losing his father to the exhilaration of harmonizing with Bowie, the outlines of a career were forming. The boy who once sat alone with records had become a young man sharpening his gift against the rough edges of reality. The stage was waiting. By the mid-1970 seconds, Luther Vandross had become a presence that insiders in the music industry could not ignore. His voice, though rarely credited, seemed to be everywhere. When Bette Midler needed lush harmonies, he was there. When Carly Simon wanted texture behind her lyrics, Luther supplied it. When Donna Summer's disco anthems demanded a silky foundation, he delivered it flawlessly. He wasn't simply a background singer, he was an architect. His ability to stack vocals with surgical precision made every song sound more expensive, more finished, more alive. Quietly, he was already indispensable. Still, indispensability did not equal recognition. The public didn't yet know his name. To change that, Luther tried stepping out front with his own group. He formed a band simply called Luther and signed with Cotillion Records. It was his first opportunity to move from the margins to the spotlight. He poured his energy into 2 albums, crafting the same kind of excellence he gave to others. But radio never caught on. The albums failed to break through commercially, and the label dropped him. For most artists, that might have been the end. For Luther, it was just another test. He had already learned from childhood tragedy and years of obscurity that perseverance was his greatest weapon. Being overlooked was nothing new, it only meant he had to wait longer. Behind the scenes, his reputation continued to grow. Producers respected his perfectionism. Artists valued his ear. He had become the person you called when you needed a background that didn't sound like background, something subtle yet essential. But Luther wanted more than whispers of praise in the studio corridors. He wanted his own name printed on the album covers. He wanted the world to know who was behind the voice. The turning point arrived in 1981. A friend slipped one of Luther's demo tapes into the hands of Larkin Arnold, a powerful executive at Epic Records. Arnold didn't just like what he heard, he was stunned. Here was a fully realized artist, not just a promising singer. Luther wasn't someone who needed to be packaged into a group or forced into a duet to be viable. He was the package. Arnold gave him a deal on the spot, granting Luther something he had never been offered before, the chance to stand entirely on his own, no compromises. The result was his debut solo album, Never Too Much. Released in 1981, it was everything Luther had been preparing for in those invisible years. From the very first note of the title track, listeners knew this wasn't just another R&B record. This was the voice. The song shot to #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and even cracked the top 40 on the Hot 100, a crossover hit that signaled a new star had arrived. The album went platinum, an extraordinary achievement for a debut. In an instant, Luther was no longer the hidden genius behind other people's success. He was front and center, undeniable. But what struck audiences even more than his chart performance was his stage presence. Luther didn't rely on fireworks or backup dancers. He didn't need pyrotechnics to hold attention. All he required was a microphone, a spotlight, and the truth in his voice. His concerts became master classes in restraint and control, where every breath was deliberate, every note infused with emotion. He could silence a crowd with a whisper, then lift them to tears with a swell of melody. His performances proved that real charisma didn't require spectacle, it required sincerity. Critics who once dismissed him as a background talent began to take notice. They wrote about his vocal control, his phrasing, his uncanny ability to make a lyric sound lived in. Fans, meanwhile, didn't need convincing. They already felt that his songs spoke directly to them, as though he had been in the room when their hearts broke or when they fell in love. In Never Too Much, they heard not just music but permission to love boldly, to miss deeply, to feel unapologetically. Yet Luther himself remained cautious. He had seen too many artists rise fast and fall faster. Success could vanish overnight, so he poured himself into the work with relentless perfectionism. Every harmony had to sit just right, every arrangement balanced like a painting. It wasn't obsession for its own sake. It was his way of building a career designed to last. If fame was fragile, excellence could be permanent. In many ways, this was the essence of Luther Vandross's career rise. Steady, intentional, brick by brick. He didn't explode onto the scene in a burst of publicity. He arrived like a cathedral, slowly revealed each song another stone, each performance another arch. By the early 1980 seconds, the world had finally been introduced to the man behind the velvet voice. He had crossed the threshold from background secret to solo phenomenon. And though the spotlight had found him at last, Luther carried with him the lessons of those long years in the shadows, patience, resilience, and an unshakable devotion to the music above all else. The 1980 seconds were a decade of reinvention in popular music. Funk grooves dominated dance floors, new jack swing would soon electrify radio, and pop culture leaned toward spectacle, big hair, bigger lights, and artists who knew how to play the tabloid game. In the middle of all that noise stood Luther Vandross, defiantly quiet. While trends sprinted forward, he anchored himself in something timeless, elegance, romance, and the art of the slow burn. Following the platinum triumph of Never Too Much, Luther released a string of albums that cemented him as the standard-bearer for modern R&B. Forever, for Always, for Love in 1982 showcased his consistency, every track polished with the same attention to phrasing and harmony that had once made him invaluable in the background. Just a year later, Busy Body in 1983 reaffirmed that this wasn't a fluke. Luther had built a lane that no one else could occupy. Then came The Night I Fell in Love in 1985 and Give Me the Reason in 1986. Each release went platinum. Each proved that a singer who refused to chase trends could still dominate an era obsessed with novelty. Among these achievements, one performance stands out as a signature. His rendition of Dionne Warwick's A House Is Not a Home, already a beloved classic. The song became something entirely new in Luther's hands. He slowed it down, stretched each phrase until it trembled with longing, and left silences that felt as heavy as the notes themselves. Audiences were stunned. Critics, who had once dismissed him as sentimental, had to admit that what he was doing was closer to surgery, an exacting art of how to let emotion breathe without collapsing into melodrama. For many fans, that single performance defined Luther's gift, his ability to make the familiar feel like revelation. What set him apart wasn't just vocal power, it was restraint. In an age when many singers shouted their way to attention, Luther mastered the opposite. He caressed syllables, teased out hidden aches, and built crescendos like cathedrals, brick by careful brick. He never rushed a lyric. He understood that love, the subject at the heart of almost all his music, wasn't loud or reckless. It was patient. It was deliberate. It was vulnerable. His songs captured that truth better than anyone else's. Yet Luther's rise in the 1980 seconds wasn't only about the records. It was about what he refused to do. He didn't live in gossip columns. He didn't court scandal or sell his private life for headlines. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He let the music speak for itself. And what it said, over and over again, was love. While others experimented with synthesizers and shock value, Luther doubled down on sincerity. He was creating music that people wanted to play at weddings, anniversaries, and solitary midnights. Songs that lived in memory long after radio cycles moved on. This devotion to authenticity made him both adored and underrated. Within black music communities, Luther was already a superstar, his records omnipresent in households, and his concerts regarded as masterclasses in how to command a stage with nothing but a microphone and heart. But the broader pop mainstream didn't always give him equal recognition. He was selling out shows, topping R&B charts, and earning platinum certifications. But somehow the narrative often positioned him as an R&B artist rather than a global icon. It was a subtle but persistent undervaluing of his contribution. Still, Luther never bent to fit someone else's mold. He built his own. By the late 1980s, his name had become synonymous with intimacy and excellence. He wasn't just singing about love, he was shaping how a generation experienced it. His music became the backdrop to first dances, reconciliations, heartbreaks, and new beginnings. In an era dominated by spectacle, Luther Vandross made sincerity the most radical statement of all. The ascent of the 1980 seconds proved something essential. He didn't need to reinvent himself to stay relevant. All he needed to do was be Luther, and that was more than enough. By the end of the 1980 seconds, Luther Vandross had already proven himself a master of consistency. Album after album, tour after tour, he delivered platinum-selling work with the reliability of a craftsman and the brilliance of an artist who refused shortcuts. Still, something lingered in the air, an unspoken question of whether his artistry would ever receive the recognition it truly deserved. That answer began to unfold in 1989 with the release of The Best of Luther Vandross, The Best of Love. This double-disc collection was more than a retrospective. It was a declaration. Alongside the catalog of hits, Luther introduced 2 new songs, including Here and Now. That ballad, tender and unwavering in its devotion, became a cultural phenomenon. It was instantly adopted as the soundtrack for weddings and anniversaries, cementing Luther as the voice of eternal vows. When the song earned him his first Grammy in 1991 for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance, it felt like validation that had been long overdue. For nearly 2 decades, he had been shaping the sound of soul music. Now the industry finally had to acknowledge it. But Luther was not finished. In that same year, he released Power of Love, an album that extended his streak of excellence and earned him 2 more Grammy Awards. It was a triumphant moment, proof that his dedication to romance and refinement was not a liability but his greatest strength. At a time when many male R&B artists leaned heavily into bravado or funk-driven grooves, Luther stood apart. He built his empire on vulnerability, phrasing love with honesty rather than swagger. Then came Songs in 1994, a project that paired him with superstar producer Babyface. The album was a lush collection of covers, including a soaring duet with Mariah Carey on Endless Love and a warm interpretation of Love the One You're With. These performances didn't simply rehash classics, they reintroduced them. Luther had a way of revealing corners of a song that listeners hadn't noticed before, uncovering hidden emotions and turning familiar material into fresh experiences. To sing alongside Mariah Carey at the height of her powers and still remain distinct was no small feat. Yet Luther's velvet tone and impeccable control made the collaboration feel like a dialogue between equals. By the mid-1990 seconds, his voice had become more than recognizable, it was essential. Radio stations, film soundtracks, and living rooms all carried his sound. He didn't need to reinvent himself with each project. Audiences came precisely for his consistency. To hear Luther was to know what you would get: excellence, intimacy, and truth. That reliability made him a mentor figure to younger artists. Whitney Houston once described him as a genius of phrasing and feeling, highlighting qualities that every aspiring singer longed to master. Others in the industry, from producers to fellow vocalists, leaned on his example as proof that sincerity could still win in an era increasingly dominated by flash. Yet even as awards and accolades piled up, Luther continued to wrestle with an invisible ceiling. He was a superstar in black music communities and in R&B circles, but in the broader pop world, his name was not always elevated to the level of Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, or Prince. His records sold millions, his concerts sold out arenas, and his influence was undeniable, but mainstream narratives sometimes treated him as a niche figure. The irony was clear. The man whose songs were played at weddings across America, whose voice defined intimacy for an entire generation, was often left just outside the circle of so-called global icons. Perhaps this was because Luther refused to play the fame game. He kept his personal life private, avoided tabloid headlines, and declined to turn himself into a spectacle. In an industry that rewarded controversy, Luther chose constancy. In a culture obsessed with reinvention, he chose refinement. That decision protected his artistry, but it also meant he was sometimes overlooked in conversations about pop supremacy. By the late 1990s, however, there was no denying what he had achieved. Across 2 decades, he had built a career that remained relevant, respected, and revered. His songs had become the soundtracks of lives, his performances a benchmark for what it meant to truly sing. Luther Vandross had not only broken through, he had stayed through, weathering trends with elegance. And though the world sometimes underrated his impact, those who truly listened knew the truth. He was not just an R&B star, he was the R&B standard. By the time Luther Vandross was filling arenas and winning Grammys, one might have imagined that his life was saturated with joy, companionship, and the fulfillment that comes from being universally adored. Yet when the curtains closed and the applause faded, the man who had given the world its most tender love songs often returned to silence. For all his public elegance, Luther's private life was a vault few ever entered. He was famously guarded in interviews. When journalists pressed him about relationships or romance, he would smile politely and redirect the conversation to safer ground: his devotion to his mother, Mary Ida, or his relentless perfectionism in the studio. He could talk for hours about a single harmony line or the challenge of getting a live performance just right, but when the subject shifted toward intimacy, he withdrew. For fans who had fallen in love to his music, the idea that he might be lonely was almost unthinkable. But friends close to him knew. Luther longed for connection, even as he feared vulnerability. The contradiction was painful. He sang about love with such conviction because he craved it. In one interview, he admitted, "I sing about love because I want it. It's my fantasy, but it hasn't found me yet." That single confession offered a rare glimpse into his inner world, a world where the most celebrated balladeer of his generation still felt untouched by the very romance he described so perfectly in song. Inevitably, questions about his sexuality swirled throughout his career. In the R&B world of the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, the environment was not kind to artists who didn't fit the mold of traditional masculinity. Homophobia lingered in both the music industry and society at large, and any public acknowledgement could have jeopardized his career. So Luther chose silence. He never addressed the rumors. By refusing to confirm or deny, he both protected himself and imprisoned himself. After his death, close friends and collaborators, including Patti LaBelle, confirmed what many had long suspected, that Luther was a gay man who never felt safe enough to come out publicly. According to LaBelle, his silence was partly about loyalty to his mother. He didn't want to burden her or expose her to potential scrutiny. Out of love, he chose secrecy. That secrecy carried a heavy weight. On stage, Luther could express longing, heartbreak, and devotion with unmatched clarity. Off stage, he bore the strain of isolation. The walls he built to protect his privacy also kept him at a distance from those who might have offered comfort. It was a lonely existence for someone whose art revolved around connection. Compounding that loneliness was his lifelong struggle with body image. Luther's weight fluctuated dramatically throughout his career. At times, he appeared slender and polished, glowing in tailored suits. At other times, he gained significant weight, withdrawing into himself while tabloids mocked his appearance. The press was merciless, often reducing a man of extraordinary artistry to cruel headlines about dieting or health. For Luther, the battle with his body became a cycle: intense diets and training sessions, followed by relapses into old habits, then renewed attempts to reshape himself. Food became both solace and struggle. This obsession with weight wasn't just about appearance. In an industry obsessed with image, Luther knew that the body often mattered as much as the voice. He carried the pressure of being flawless not only vocally but physically, and that burden chipped away at his peace of mind. Behind the dazzling smile and impeccable performances, he wrestled with depression. The very perfectionism that fueled his success also drove his self-criticism. He was adored on stage, yet frequently isolated off stage. The more the world praised him, the higher the walls around him grew. And yet, through all of it, Luther never allowed his private pain to taint his public art. If anything, it may have deepened it. His voice carried an ache, a yearning that audiences could feel even if they couldn't name its source. When he sang of love unfulfilled, it resonated because it was true. The vulnerability he feared in life found release in song. His silence in interviews was offset by confession in music. Every line, every phrase, every sigh within a melody bore the weight of his unspoken struggles. This was the paradox of Luther Vandross. The man who gave the world its most eloquent language for love was himself searching for the very intimacy he described. His conflicts, loneliness, secrecy, and body image battles never diminished his brilliance. If anything, they infused it with authenticity. He lived behind walls, but his songs tore those walls down for everyone else. And in that gap between the artist and the man lay the true cost of being brilliant and silent in a world that demanded both conformity and exposure. By the early 2010s, Luther Vandross stood as one of music's most reliable treasures. His voice still glowed with warmth, his stage presence still shimmered with grace, and his audience remained loyal as ever. To the casual observer, he seemed untouchable. Yet behind the elegance of his tailored suits and the radiance of his smile, his body was waging a battle he could not outsing. Years of yo-yo dieting, hypertension, and diabetes had taken a toll that no melody could disguise. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Concert dates were quietly canceled. In interviews, he appeared less energetic, his breath shorter, his movements slower. For fans who had long regarded his voice as indestructible, these changes were easy to overlook. After all, Luther had been through challenges before and had always returned stronger. But this time, the battle was deeper, more dangerous. On the 16th of April 2003, just 4 days before his 52nd birthday, tragedy struck. At his home in Manhattan, Luther suffered a massive stroke. The news reverberated through the music world like a thunderclap. How could a man whose voice seemed eternal suddenly be silenced? Fans were shocked, artists devastated, and the industry at large confronted the fragility of even its most gifted talents. For weeks, Luther's fate hung in the balance. The stroke left him in a coma for nearly 2 months. When he finally opened his eyes, it was clear that life had changed. He had lost significant motor skills and struggled with speech. For an artist whose entire identity revolved around his voice, the cruel irony was unbearable. Imagine a painter losing his sight or a dancer losing his legs. That was the scale of Luther's devastation. The man who had built a career on vocal precision and emotional phrasing now faced the possibility of never singing again. Support flooded in from every corner. Fans mailed thousands of get-well cards. Radio stations dedicated hours of airtime to his classics. Fellow artists from Aretha Franklin to Stevie Wonder, from Patti LaBelle to Elton John, sent prayers, messages, and public declarations of love. The music world held its collective breath, hoping for a miracle. And, for a brief moment, a miracle seemed possible. In 2004, Luther's team released Dance with My Father, an album recorded before his stroke but made newly poignant by his condition. The title track, a tender tribute to the father he lost in childhood, resonated with devastating intimacy. It was Luther at his most personal, singing not just about universal love but about his own yearning. Listeners around the globe connected instantly. The song became one of the most emotionally powerful of his career. The Grammys that year recognized it with 4 awards, including Song of the Year and Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. It was a triumph and a heartbreak all at once, because Luther, the man who had poured everything into those notes, could not stand on stage to accept the accolades himself. Instead, Alicia Keys read his message aloud. "Remember, when I say goodbye, it's never for long because I believe in the power of love." The words silenced the room. It was both a thank you and perhaps a farewell. After Dance with My Father, Luther's appearances grew increasingly rare. Updates about his condition were scarce, filtered through brief statements about rehabilitation and therapy. Friends described him as determined, fighting to regain mobility and speech. But those closest to him also sensed fatigue. Decades of giving everything to music had taken their toll, and now his body asked for rest. The silence that followed was heavy. For fans who had grown accustomed to his voice as a constant companion, the absence was palpable. Luther had always been a private man, but now the quiet felt different, final, foreboding. Each month without news deepened the sense that the Luther Vandross they knew might never return. On the 1st of July 2005, the fear became reality. Luther Vandross died at the JFK Medical Center in Edison, New Jersey, from complications related to a heart attack he had suffered 2 months earlier. He was only 54 years old. The news spread quickly, stunning the world. Yes, His health struggles had been public, but his passing still felt abrupt, like a candle extinguished mid-glow. Tributes poured in immediately. Aretha Franklin called him one of the sweetest and most talented men I've ever known. Stevie Wonder, Patti LaBelle, Elton John, Alicia Keys, and countless others echoed the same grief. Radio stations played Dance with My Father on repeat. Fans flooded online forums and message boards with stories of how his music had carried them through heartbreak, celebrated their weddings, or comforted them in loneliness. For many, losing Luther felt like losing family. His voice had been in their homes, their cars, their most intimate memories. His funeral, true to his nature, was private. There were no media spectacles, no cameras capturing the moment. It was simply love, music, and farewell. He left no public partner, no children, and little insight into the private life he had guarded so carefully. What he left instead was his art, songs that had already proven immortal. Luther Vandross's final years were marked by struggle, but his departure only underscored the magnitude of his gift. He was the last great crooner of soul, a man who had sung the deepest truths of love while quietly carrying his own burdens. His stroke silenced him physically, but Dance with My Father ensured that his voice would echo forever. Even in the face of devastating loss, Luther gave the world one last masterpiece, a parting gift from an artist who had always poured his entire being into every note. When Luther Vandross passed in 2005, it felt as though an era of soul music closed with him. Yet in truth, his voice never left. Nearly 2 decades later, his songs continue to pulse through radios, streaming playlists, and wedding halls, as alive as ever. There is something eternal in the way he sang, something that refuses to fade. To describe him as a singer feels almost inadequate. He was a craftsman of emotion, a builder of atmosphere, a man who could take 3 minutes of melody and turn it into a lifetime memory. Luther's voice was velvet and steel at once, tender enough to wrap around the most fragile feelings, strong enough to anchor them so they wouldn't fall apart. He didn't just perform lyrics, he inhabited them. Every pause was a heartbeat, every inflection a confession. Fans still recall how a simple phrase like, "A house is not a home," could feel like their own diary entry, as though he had read their private ache and set it to music. That capacity for intimacy, for making millions of listeners believe he was speaking directly to them, is why his legacy endures. His influence stretches far beyond his own recordings. Beyoncé, John Legend, Usher, Alicia Keys, each of them has pointed to Luther as an inspiration. Jamie Foxx once called him the blueprint for every soulful singer that came after him. Mariah Carey praised his phrasing and control, qualities she herself is celebrated for. Justin Timberlake cited Luther as essential to his own vocal development, proof that Vandross's reach extended into pop and beyond. In every falsetto run, every carefully placed phrase, you can hear echoes of his technique. The accolades bear out his stature. Over the course of his career, Luther sold more than 35 million records worldwide. He won 8 Grammy Awards, including 4 for Best Male R and B Vocal Performance. His star was added to the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2014, nearly a decade after his passing, and in 2021 he was inducted into the National Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame. These honors, though meaningful, only scratched the surface of what he represented. Awards measure moments. Luther's art measured lifetimes. What makes his legacy unique is how deeply personal it remains. His songs were not just hits, they were companions. Never Too Much became the anthem of abundance, a celebration of love's excess that never feels dated. His take on A House Is Not a Home remains one of the most devastatingly beautiful performances in modern music, teaching singers and audiences alike that restraint can be more powerful than fireworks. Dance with My Father, released at the twilight of his life, became a universal hymn for memory and longing, bridging generations and circumstances. These songs weren't just tracks on an album, they were emotional landmarks people built their lives around. Even in the business of legacy, Luther's story stands out. Many celebrity estates become battlegrounds after death, plagued by disputes and diluted by commercialization. Luther's estate, by contrast, remained relatively free of public conflict. This quiet dignity reflected the way he lived, private, controlled, intentional. Licensing and publishing continued to generate revenue, keeping his music alive not just in memory but in culture. His songs have been sampled by hip-hop artists, covered by younger vocalists, and featured in films, television shows, and commercials. The Vandross sound, far from fading, continues to find new audiences. And yet, despite all this, the word underrated still clings to him. Perhaps it is because Luther refused to give the world what it so often demands: spectacle. He did not cultivate scandal. He did not give interviews that exposed every corner of his personal life. He did not reinvent himself with flashy personas. Instead, he gave consistency, sincerity, and craft. In a culture that often equates visibility with importance, Luther's privacy may have cost him a place in certain mainstream narratives. But for those who know, for those who listen, he is beyond compare. His enduring legacy is not just about the notes he sang, but about the feelings he left behind. Couples still choose his ballads for their first dances. Families still cry to dance with my father. Young singers still measure themselves against his phrasing. In a world that moves too quickly, his music reminds us to slow down, to savor, to feel. Tenderness, depth, sincerity, these were his gifts. They remain his bequest. Luther Vandross's story is not just one of triumph and tragedy, but of permanence. He may not always appear in the same breath as Michael Jackson or Whitney Houston when people list global icons. But in the quiet moments of human life, the vows, the heartbreaks, the reconciliations, his voice is often the one we hear. That, more than any chart position or award, is why his legacy endures. Luther made soul music feel again, and for that, his place in history is undeniable. We began with a paradox, a voice that defined love for millions, yet a man whose own life remained cloaked in mystery. Luther Vandross stood on stages around the world, delivering perfection night after night. But when the lights dimmed, he retreated into the privacy he guarded fiercely. That choice, noble and costly, left the world with music as his truest autobiography. He didn't chase the tabloids or the spectacle. He never relied on scandal to stay relevant. Instead, he trusted his voice to do the work. And what a voice it was, silky, aching, powerful. It could steady a trembling hand at a wedding altar, console the lonely in the dark, or carry a memory of a father long gone. His artistry was both intimate and immense, capable of shrinking a stadium into a living room and expanding a simple lyric into a prayer. Yet Luther's story also reminds us of how often true greatness goes underappreciated. While his peers became household names around the globe, Luther sometimes remained on the periphery of those conversations. Perhaps it was because he refused to play the fame game, or perhaps it was because his art was quiet where the industry demanded noise. But underrated does not mean unseen. For those who truly listened, Luther Vandross was, and remains, the standard. His legacy is not just in the awards or the sales, but in the countless lives touched by his song. He offered tenderness in a world that often rewards toughness, vulnerability in a culture that praises bravado. That is his power. That is his permanence. Luther Vandross may have left us too soon, but his voice lives on, timeless, necessary, unforgettable. And in every whispered lyric and soaring chorus, he reminds us, when it comes to love, it's never too much.